Today's podcast is sponsored by the Athletic Development Games educational program. This program includes a video library of fun and engaging games aimed at kids ages 4 to 10 years old. In the program, you'll find activities for speed, coordination, jumping, and more, with new videos added each month. The games are fun, engaging, and they also invoke the imagination. It's given me great ideas already for my youth sports teams, as well as plenty of games to play with my own children. To sign up for the course, you can head to athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app, and you can use the coupon code JUSTFLY, that's JUSTFLY with all caps, at checkout for an exclusive 50% off. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. This week's guests are Dr. Ken Clark and Cory Walts. Ken Clark is an Associate Professor of Kinesiology at Westchester University. He has over a decade of coaching experience at various levels of athletic performance, and he's also a sought-after speed training expert and biomechanical researcher. Cory Walts is the Director of Strength and Conditioning at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's been leading sports performance programs there since 2019. Cory was also a finalist for the NSCA College Strength and Conditioning Coach of the Year Award. On the show today, Ken and Cory will be talking about practical solutions for speed training in a team sport setting, as well as the differences between sprint mechanics in team sport athletes and track and field individuals. They'll be talking sprint profiling, speed training methods such as mini hurdles and resisted sprint variations. This and much more on the episode. It was great talking to these two, and I'm excited to get this episode going. Let's get to 426 here with Ken Clark and Cory Walts. Cory, Ken, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm excited to chat with you both today. Let's start by telling me a little bit about how you guys met and some of the work that you've been doing together. I think it's been for over a decade now. So let's start with a little bit about that and how you guys got together and got started in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Cory, you can take it away. Just kind of describe how we met and everything.
Yeah, it's a story that started in College Park, Maryland. We both went to grad school there. I actually stayed there. Ken only was there for a semester, but we fell in love with the process of learning about sprint technique and how that applies to a variety of sports. Although Ken left, we stayed in touch, and I ended up working my first job at Haverford College, which is a Division III school outside of Philadelphia. And Ken happened to play at their rival when he was in college. So we had this bond about a small Division III school. And once I started working there, he moved back into the area at some point prior to that. And we worked together, long story short, and we collaborated. I was the head strength and conditioning coach. Ken worked at Westchester University. He came over, he participated in our speed sessions, and that relationship continued to blossom to where we are today. Ken continues to evolve his pretty impressive portfolio, and I'm at University of Pennsylvania as a director of strength and conditioning, working with a variety of sports. One of them, men's lacrosse, and Ken comes over about once a week. We participate in a variety of projects, but a lot of the practical work is with our men's lacrosse team.
Yeah, great way of summarizing it. And yeah, so we've been kind of friends and colleagues for close to 15 years now, and yeah, most of it has revolved around kind of sports performance training and speed development, and it's kind of been just a great way to stay in touch, and also just to kind of for me to keep my hands dirty, so to speak, as far as coaching athletes at a high level, and so it's been fun working with Cory, and yeah, our most recent collaborations have been with the University of Pennsylvania athletes, and in particular the lacrosse team. So I'm lucky to do a little bit of coaching at Westchester, and then also a little bit with Penn, which is great. So yeah, it's been fun, and happy to have us both on here on the podcast. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. So
yeah,
yep, very excited about this, Joel. One of the things I love about this podcast is how holistic it is, and that's one of the things that we preach at Penn, and excited to dive into some of these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about that sometimes. Is it a lot of topics because I'm a little ADD and I like, oh yeah, this thing, but it is fun because the more things you gather, you can integrate those. And especially too with what we'll talk about with like team sports and track speed, and even within team sports, I'm always fascinated. And we even talked a little bit before we pushed record, lacrosse. I remember David Weck talking about the movie Apocalypto, and you're running with the spear, and how does that change things? And then of course my curiosity is, how might it change if you are regularly carrying a tool around in your sport? And so I'd like to start with, what are some of the, maybe I'll ask it this way. is what are some of the defining factors that separate team sport speed? We can start from very general and then maybe even within some of the team sports a little bit, but what are some defining factors of team sport athletes and how they sprint versus track and field athletes? And then how do we go about looking at that in light of how the athletes run? And are we going to make changes, or how do we go about it in light of the needs of a team sport athlete versus track and field?
Yeah, I could maybe start off on this one and then Cory dive in. But yeah, I mean, I think to kind of state the obvious, you look at a 60-meter, 100-meter, 200-meter dash, right? They've got a very mostly linear and pre-planned kind of race model. I mean, yes, the people around you affect you to a certain extent. We saw that right in the Olympics a little bit, but for the most part, you're focused on you, and you're not, reacting to an opponent, so to speak, and you're not dodging and weaving and changing directions out there. So I think that's clearly the most obvious starting point. I think the way that affects mechanics is that we have team sport athletes that perhaps once they're into their either acceleration and then even to a greater extent top speed, perhaps can't afford to get into quite the same positions, because what's optimal may be from a track and field perspective with regards to sprinting technique is not optimal or doesn't lend itself to the best game speed performance, for a team sport athlete. And, it's interesting for me, Joel, you and I have talked about this, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And then now again, and my thoughts personally have really changed over the last 5 to 10 years. It used to be like, oh, well, all team sport athletes should look like track and field athletes, and there's one correct way to run. And I just definitely do not feel that way anymore. And, I think that's really kind of infiltrated in a good way, kind of what Cory and I, kind of how we work with team sport athletes as well. But kind of before I kick it over to Cory here, I think kind of this thought that team sport athletes need to be fast in a way that still affords them the opportunity to be able to react to an opponent, react to a ball, that sort of thing. And what those positions look like, is maybe just not the same as if you look like an Olympic sprinter at the 70-meter mark of the 100-meter dash, something like that. So I think that's the very macro level take on the subject, is like, yeah, maybe they're just not, maybe models for team sport and track and field athletes just are not the same and should not be the same, basically. So Cory, take it from there.
With team sport athletes, and I'm speaking from the lens of somebody that works in college that is limited by the amount of time that we can spend with them, I always think about the low-hanging fruit and like, how much capacity do we have to change something? Speaking from the off season in the Ivy League, for instance, we only have 2 hours regularly in very large chunks of the off season to do any strength and conditioning with them. That includes a weight room. So what are the low hanging fruits? Is 10 minutes a week really focused on technique really going to move the needle? Or should we provide a stimulus and do it in a way that helps them remain healthy, teaches them how more or less to limit backside and hit near the center of mass, related to hamstring injuries and the running technique. So going down into the weeds, especially with team sport athletes that have so much technically and tactically change of direction wise, probably just not the most efficient way to handle it.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely makes sense with limited time, efficiency. And I think a lot too about, it's like a linchpin. Like, what's the pin you can pull that sets the most efficient chain of events off? And with team sport athletes as well, I feel like, I know there's like more research coming out in terms of how do we screen a team sport athlete? Is it different than how you would look at, and you mentioned different than how we'd look at track and field athletes in terms of their efficiency? Are they going to get hurt? I know, Ken, one of the things you and I talked about, I'd totally be curious what either of you have to think about this one, is a team sport athlete running just through gates where they're not chasing someone in their usual reactivity versus a team sport athlete. Now there's things on the field, and will that change because they're now reacting to something instead of, wait, you want me to sprint? How do I do that again? There's a lot of people who haven't done track. There's a little bit more of their ability to handle rhythm in the air and get out of the rhythm of a team sport reactivity is challenging, to say the least. And so I do believe that could impact mechanics. A long-winded way to say, and maybe you can touch on backside too, like addressing backside mechanics, just because team sport athletes certainly appear to have more in many situations. How do you know what to change and when to change? And yeah, I this could be a big question, but yeah, just you mentioned the backside a little bit, but could we dig a little bit deeper into that? How do we know what and when to change, given what we're seeing, both just sprinting through gates and then even observing on the field and trying to watch and see how things are going on the field?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll take the first part of it. I'll kick it over to Cory, and this is a question that probably could take us 10 minutes to get through, which is okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's a great question. So I'll dive into just a little bit of our latest research, which isn't published yet, but it's kind of in review or about to be in review. So I'll give away a lot of it, albeit maybe not most of it or all of it. But anyway, so we looked at intercollegiate athletes, Division I, Division II, and males and females, but the data we've analyzed right now is of the males. We had nearly 100 male athletes, essentially 30 track and field athletes and 70 team sport athletes, so pretty good mix. And track and field athletes were primarily sprinters and some pretty good ones to boot. We had guys with PRs in the 10-1, 10-2, 10-3 range. So some guys that could really run, Division I and Division II, so they weren't all that fast for sure. And then we had, lacrosse and soccer and baseball players. And so a lot of the athletes that Cory works with were involved with this from Penn. So we got a nice sampling of kind of track and field versus team sport. Now, mind you, not team sport that included like football or rugby. And maybe that's a different story if there's like football guys who have run track in the past, right? But so for these team sport and track athletes that we looked at, these 100, a really kind of cool story kind of came about across the board. And so for starters, some of the basic variables that you would expect from prior research to kind of correlate with top speed did. Like, okay, faster runners had shorter ground contact times, faster step rates and step lengths, more vertical force, more vertical stiffness, like that sort of thing. Not a shocker there per se. And when you looked at some of the joint angular kinematics, same sort of thing. Analyzed across the entire sample, all 100 combined, the faster top speeds were correlated with kind of like more front side, less backside, that sort of thing, like a better kind of like swing thigh angle at touchdown. What was really interesting was kind of when you started to break it down and get in the weeds a little bit more. So what we found was actually, if you looked at like the slower track and field athletes, like the faster track and field athletes, is pretty much the classic story that you would expect. But if you look at the slower track and field athletes and then the fastest team sport athletes, so actually both groups, the slower track and field guys and the fastest team sport guys, they had a mean top speed that was about the same, like 21 miles an hour, roughly 9.3 plus meters per second. But they accomplished this in like totally different ways. So the slow track and field athletes were still kind of like, pretty front side, pretty short contact times and contact lengths, etc. But the team sport guys were not. They had longer contact times, longer contact lengths, like less, more backside thigh, less front side thigh mechanics. And so kind of the really cool thing that emerged from this data set was like, hey, our fast team sport guys can hit, really fast top speeds, as fast as some of the slower track guys, but with a different strategy. And frankly, a strategy that makes sense from a team sport standpoint, if being like way up in the air and having a lot of like high knee lift, for example, maybe doesn't make sense from a context of a gameplay scenario. So that was like one of the big picture stories that emerged. And I know Cory can kind of touch on what the practical applications are of that. Certainly the conclusion is not like, hey, technique doesn't matter. That couldn't be further from the truth. But maybe, the practical application is like, hey, we got to train these guys to run fast, safe, as opposed to like run them to look like track and field athletes per se. So that was kind of one of the big macro level findings that came out of it. And then not to steal all the oxygen here, but Joel, off the air before we came on, we kind of talked about those old lab videos of like the team sport athlete on the right and the track and field athlete on the left. And, you and I have talked about how kind of my thoughts on that have evolved over the last 10 years, and they have. And I always like to point out now, like, hey, in that video, like that guy on the right-hand side, that team sport athlete, he's like the biggest contrast, visual contrast that could ever ever be as far as how long and loopy backside is.
Yeah.
Like, that's not really what our fastest team sport athletes look like. And I think that's important to note, that like there is variation, and our fast team sport athletes didn't look like track and field athletes. But on the other hand, it also wasn't like that kind of black and white image that's now been burned in our head from those videos too. So
yeah, I will say I was so impressed with that guy's actually athleticism, in the sense, like, you would look at that guy, for those listening who haven't seen it, I'm sure most people probably have. It's, guy in the treadmill, you of course, Ken, are in the background, and this guy's like almost falling forward. I'd imagine if it wasn't for that harness, he very well might have.
He was struggling to hang on.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way.
But I couldn't believe, like, honestly, the catching of himself each stride to me was quite impressive, given everything that was going on. So yeah, I just think that's a really amazing video in general. But yeah, it's context is always everything, isn't it? Because I think, to see the average, instead of it just being that guy, hey, what's the average team sport athlete with no track experience? And what is that general representation going to look like? And then even amongst other sports too, like I think, Ken, you had mentioned like women's soccer players' tendencies with their arms, or Cory, like I was asking you even before, like running with a stick, and just some of the little subtleties there, even football by position. And within that, that's where I would think, and I'm guessing that technology is starting to get us there in a way with, okay, now that we have almost this bucket of track and the expectations there, and we have team sport and some expectations there, knowing that, and Cory, like you said, how much time do we have in this? How worth it is to get in the weeds of a team sport athlete, or multiple archetypes even of different team sport athletes, and start to say, and of course, every time we try to intervene, there's also a potential consequence. Oh, you're not running, or every time even you say that or would insinuate that, I think there could be a negative if the athlete is self-organizing well. And so all this to be said, I know, Cory, you had mentioned it, just with limited time, how much to invest, and then just having good general abilities. I will say too, it's funny, even as I've talked about a lot of things, I know, we might, Ken, you and I might disagree a little bit on the benefit of like a squatted running archetype, or putting that in the ecosystem. But I do think there's just marching, I think, is massively beneficial. Just like any march, be it a skip, even just marching cross connects, those kind of things. I think there's good value there. But anyways, long-winded way of saying, you have your athletes, you have a team sport group. How within this team sport group do we define acceptable bandwidths? I know the research is still helping that. We have quadrants and stuff, but yeah, any thoughts on that, on how that work is expanding?
One quick thought too, and you mentioned this briefly, the psychological component of all this and the training. Yeah. Obviously, track and field athletes, as they grow up, it's part of their culture to do the speed technique work. Yeah. Team sport athletes, more or less, it's not, unless they were immersed in that culture and through high school or whatnot. So creating an environment where they're bought into the process, like how can they see their improvement relatively quickly? We know this generation and how quick they need to see that return on investment. Little things like how can you gamify speed training? We'll get into this more, but we do a good amount of wickets, partly because, yes, we want to improve the knee height for a variety of reasons, but also there is this skill component. So they are learning in a way how to step over the hurdles and learn a different drill than they've done before. So they get that psychological feedback pretty quickly. And there's a bit of that gamification too. So that's something I'm always thinking about, the experience the team sport athlete is going through in this limited amount of time.
Yeah. I've seen, with the wickets as well. I probably mentioned this on the show. I saw this, it was probably almost 10 years ago at this point. It was a trainer from Spain. I don't think he's on social media or anything. He works with some Premier League clubs, just kind of low key. And he would have the athletes be doing some agility work on one side of the field. I don't even think it was anything that necessarily mattered. It was just do some stuff that changes direction, gets you tired. And then he had little mini hurdles set up to transition to sprint to the other side of the field. So they do agility, run over the mini hurdles. They're on the other side of the field now. So kind of like almost recreating these transition zones that encourages a level of timing and being. For me, I definitely like not getting anchored. Or I guess like there's almost like the well of backside. If your strategy is so one-sided, I feel like that might be more like the athletes have more options. That's always going to be a good thing. And so, but telling them that not in a way like you have to run like this, you're doing too much backside, you're going to pull your hamstring or something. You know, I just think that's it's a very that's probably where the nuance really lies. Is hey, let's just do it.
And you know, I'll just tell you kind of some of the, I guess, red flags that we look for, and then you know, Cory can kind of dive into the nuts and bolts of what we've done really with Penn Lacrosse the last 2 years. But you know, I think generally speaking, even if we kind of say, all right, well, we're not looking for our team sport athletes necessarily to look exactly like track and field athletes. Like we know that even the fast ones are going to have probably a different strategy, at least on certain points. With that being said, you know, clearly what we don't want are to see, you know, mechanics that look, you know, like they're going to lead potentially to injury. Though, like, you know, landing way out in front of the center of mass, running with, you know, or, you know, postural control or, you know, really excessive pelvic tilt, that sort of thing. Some of the things that are, you know, known in the literature to kind of be linked to soft tissue injury. And I think, you know, having more options and maybe, you know, we're looking at a different distribution of front side and backside, perhaps with team sport athletes than we are with track and field athletes, but still making sure that maybe some of the basics are done correctly is really the big goal with the team sport guys in the limited amount of time that Cory talked about. And so with some of the top speed work we've done with Penn Lacrosse and others, it's more about, again, the low hanging fruit and what can we do just to reinforce that reinforce the basics, reinforce that they are running, you know, without overstriding, tendency to run on the correct part of the foot with like a 4-foot strike and that sort of thing. And I think some of the constraints that we've introduced have done a pretty good job of that within a big group setting. And I know that was one of the other things we wanted to talk about today, was just like how to handle that within the context of a really big group setting. So I'll have Cory kind of give you the nuts and bolts there, but that's definitely how we've kind of, I think, looked at like the results of some of our own research and research of others and said, okay, well, you know, what is this kind of new thought about what we want our team sport athletes to look like? And what's kind of the best way to accomplish that in a short amount of time in a big group and kind of get on the, you know, try to achieve the lowest hanging fruit. So that's kind of where we're at, I think, right now.
The main way that we individualized the training was by speed profiling or sprint profiling the group. Ken can get into exactly how we did that in a bit, but more or less, we wanted to determine if somebody relative to their peers, relative to the members of the team, were deficient in acceleration or top speed. And we just have Brower timers. We do 40-yard sprints with gates every 10 yards just in terms of testing. So we just looked at relative to the others, you know, the first 0 to 10 versus the 30 to 40. And then we bucketed them, and we had an acceleration group that needed to work on acceleration. We had a top speed that needed to work on that, and we had a balanced. And so if you just think of a bell curve, majority of the team was in this balanced, and then, you know, the certain amount was in the other two. And all we did was have more or less 3 stations on a given speed day, and we'd have wickets more often than not. We'd have some sort of timed run. Sometimes we would go for a PR, just a 20 to 30 yard build-in. Oftentimes we would do the curved run with a speed golf. You know, I know you talked about that several times. So trying to hit a certain number, roughly 95%, gamifying the situation a little bit too, keeping them under their threshold sometimes. And then we had an acceleration group. One tool we used a lot this past year was bullet belts. Joel, are you familiar with bullet belts?
Yeah.
Your ability to quickly contrast and rip that away, feel the difference, feel the position, work on the slow rise. And all we did was manipulate the number of reps that they're doing based on the sprint profile. So that worked well. That got them engaged in the process. The numbers showed the value in it too. But Ken can get into kind of how we did that if you're interested.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I always love the nuts and bolts of things. I had one thing, but before that, I just had one little thing I was thinking about with, like, okay, you have a team sport athlete. How do I expect this person to run? I look at track athletes. And I was looking at, I think it's there was some research that one of you had highlighted on your Twitter, social media. It might have been like the SMAS. I think that might be the acronym for basically like, it's like a score on all these checkpoints. And one of the checkpoints, and I know there's a lot of work that's being done on that now. And one of the checkpoints that I feel like whatever your model is for how someone should run, one of them was lumbo pelvic control. And I think like, okay, no matter what I think, and this is just where like the general piece I think comes in. And can you do, even having an athlete go through a variety of, you could say, yes, marching drills, but also even like Russian lunge switches or different things in the gym, you're probably going to get a good idea of where they're at from an ability to time their limbs around their center, I guess, for a different way of explaining that. And so I look at, it's almost like I would look at, my thought would be one of those general linchpins, regardless of who you are. Yeah, because track athletes obviously pull their hamstrings too. It's not like, yeah, track athletes don't pull their hamstrings at all. They're always fine, you know, like, and I with that, I would say I'd be interested to see if someone ever did this plot of multi-sport athletes, if you have a track multi-sport background versus you only did team sport and then did incidents of hamstring injuries. I think like in zooming out, that'd be a really cool way of looking at that from a different perspective. Maybe someone has done that. I don't know. Or if someone's looking for a thesis or something.
Yeah, right. We'll give it to the next grad student.
Yeah.
No, it's the SMAS, I think, is great. You know, Chris Brahma, I know you've had him on the podcast before with JB, and obviously, I think that research and that criterion is that scale is awesome. I think, you know, a lot of those things that are highlighted as red flags in the SMAS are certainly things that we would look for from a, you know, qualitative coaching standpoint as saying, okay, well, this is a red flag for, you know, potentially soft tissue strain, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think, and Cory and I have discussed this a lot over the last 2 to 3 years, is like, hey, is the goal to get these guys to look like track and field athletes, or is the goal to get them running fast, safe, so that we can apply a better stimulus in practice and have them kind of running fast on a repeated basis in practice, and doing so with mechanics that are, that are generally speaking not going to light up a lot of those red flags, so to speak. And to me, that may be kind of ultimately where we've landed, so to speak. And I think, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see where the SMAS goes as far as kind of helping practitioners kind of identify those scores. But I think certainly that's got a lot of promise. And lumbopelvic control, like you said, it kind of doesn't matter what you believe in from a model standpoint. I'm not sure there's many that would consider bad lumbopelvic control as a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think the one I'm always like the guy who wants to be a little contrarian and think of the place it could be good. I'm like, sure. I have done like excessive anterior pelvic tilt on split squats to get the glutes more sometimes. Like, it's an interesting way of doing that, but I wouldn't recommend someone try to sprint like that. So, yeah.
Just to kind of follow up on the sprint profiling, because I think that's a pretty hot topic, obviously, or at least it has been over the last 5 years. But what we really tried to do this last year is just make it very user friendly. So Cory already described this, but sprint profiling, for those who are kind of familiar with it, you can do it a number of different ways. Radar gun, 1080, Dynaspeed, you name it, any way that you can get kind of instantaneous velocity of your athletes over the course of a 30-meter, 40-yard sprint, whatever. But we really we tried to simplify that. We did do 40-yard dashes with Brower gates every 10 yards, but in essence, what we did was essentially just kind of look at the ratio of top speed to acceleration and bucket it from there, as Cory already described. And I think to a large degree in a big team setting, although maybe that's not like sprint profiling to the exact letter of the law, you're still accomplishing a lot of the same things, which is getting guys the stimulus they need. So yeah, that's kind of how we used technology, so to speak, in the training for this past year. So
I'd be curious too with those buckets. On one level, I guess on the level of, okay, if I run like this in my sport, do I need to have longer strides, lift my knees more? Where in the sport would I need that? But I mean, at the very least, it's more options. Hey, my main option is just spinning my wheels. Okay, I'm giving you the option of having a slower transition if you ever need to, or to take longer strides, or what does this feel like? But my question would be in the retests, in the speed retests, or to me, really, I mean, I would love to see on the field in so many ways. Like, and I know that's hard. I feel like it's a future. Maybe it's a dystopian future in some ways, that like too much like tech, but like you have accelerometers on each limb and it tells you your timing score and like all this stuff in real time on field. And That'd be like brutal. Like have like a beeper on your back. Oh, you're out of timing. Slow down. Or something. That'd be I don't know. That'd be maybe 50 years from now, and probably not much fun way to play. But yeah, just curious.
The AI able to generate the ability to analyze all that, but I don't know what human can get into those weeds.
Yeah, no, I would not be a fun way to play. I've seen too. Even when I was in grad school, I worked in the biomechanics lab, and we I don't know if this was for class or in the lab, but they were showing us factory workers. Someone had given them a beeper on their back that said when their back angle was too much, and it wanted them to deep squat like baby squat or child squat every box. But honestly, and you could tell the workers were getting so annoyed and upset, like, because it just wasn't efficient. Like, that's not an efficient way to lift everything necessarily. And two, like, your body's going to fall to the most efficient position. It's just a lot more than, you only can child squat deep. I mean, maybe they can't open up space in their pelvis or hips or, and maybe there's a lot of, anyways. So just with that, I do think there's that, certainly that potential for too much feedback. I'm kind of getting lost in the weeds. I apologize. I was going to ask, I know we were going to talk a little bit more, if you have any other thoughts on how you reassess and things you look at or on the field. And then I did want to get in a little more of the nuts and bolts of those training pieces. I know you mentioned the bullet belt, Cory, and it's just so funny. I saw that like 25 years ago and it looks cool. And then you kind of forget about it. And then you hear about the resisted running and sprinting and how it changes the force profile and how contrasts and like, oh yeah, I need to get one of these again. It's any thoughts on retesting? And then I'd love to dig a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of those bucketing programs you guys do.
Ken, you want to talk about some of the numbers that we saw?
Yeah, I can touch on that, and then I'll turn it over to Cory for more in depth on kind of bullet belts and bucketing. So yeah, I mean, we had in total about like 3.5 hours of just total speed training time over the entire semester. Like it was just basically 11 speed training sessions of 15 minutes. So it really was a pretty constrained amount of time. It was good. The team average improved 1/10 of a second in the 40. Top speeds went up. And then if you looked at like what the top speeds were over the entire year, because we did fly 10s throughout the season, including in season as well. I think the stats were like the first day we did fly 10s in last week of August. I think we had like 40% of the team could break 20 miles an hour. And then when we did fly 10s in April, we had, I think it's close to 80% of the team could break 20 miles an hour, including we had many more guys that could hit 21 miles an hour. So there was kind of a good acute improvement in 40-yard dash time, kind of given the training time that we had. And then there was also this, hey, you keep up this top speed training over the course of the year, even in season. And we had, kind of good improvements in top speed throughout the year. We kind of tell this story as like to tie a bow on it. Our team captain, the team captain, who's like an all Ivy performer, hit like a PR in like the last speed training session of the year, like a 0.92 fly 10 yard, which is like, over 22 miles an hour. So when you have like your fifth year, senior captain PRing in his last ever speed training session, that's like a pretty good sign of like long-term speed development. So yeah, we were happy with that. Of course, we always evolve and examine our training and our results, and we'll probably tweak things a little bit for this upcoming year. But overall, we thought that was pretty good progress considering what we had done. So, and yeah, Cory can kind of give you some more details on the buckets. The bullet belts, worked well, and we both like sleds and everything, but for this. Just to kick it off before I turn it over to Cory, for this application, for this setting, the bullet belts were a great way to go. So,
Joel, as Ken's talking about the senior captain setting the PR on the last day, I keep thinking about all the podcasts you've done and speaking about environment and what is the stimulus around you and how does that impact your performance. So on that day that Ken is speaking about, are you familiar with the pen relays?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So the pen relays were that week, and we were down. They kick us off of our field, which is in the Franklin Field, 130 years old. So we have to practice down at these turf fields, which are kind of short walk, but there's two turf fields side by side. We were practicing on one, and right next to it, they're doing the full warm up for pen relays. So think about the music, think about the people, think about the energy. So we're practicing there. We're doing our speed work right next to them, and he hits his PR. So not only does the training impact that, but so does the environment. So it's so influential. But yeah, I mean, I explained it to a little bit this bucketing concept, but it just reminds me of how influential consistency is. Small doses over time, micro dosing. As Ken said, we were doing 15 minutes once a week. So we never went over. I think we counted as 9 full speed reps in a session, and that was high. We would normally be in the 5 to 7 range of, post warm up full speed reps. That includes the 3 stations. But again, how can you raise the level of intent? So how can you apply this to the individual and give them that little bit of individualization that can move the needle a little bit, whatever kind of technique or small area stimulus they need? So that's what we focused on, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. But that was our plan.
Yeah, sure thing. A couple of questions just from a couple of things you'd said, Cory. One was the bullet belt. Was that more for the needs acceleration bucket, like group?
Correct.
Primarily. Oh, okay, nice.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just so funny too, because I'd love to have a 1080 sprint or anything Dynaspeed, but it's almost like because I know those you can play with anything with the load and then release or whatever. It's funny what you forget about. It's almost it was almost the bullet belts were real popular right before I think I started like getting in my mid-20s as a track coach, and I don't know, I never really used them, but yeah, I definitely think there's something that there's always a special place for those simple tools, especially as I think college budgets and pro budgets grow and there is more technology. Sometimes just finding the smallest thing that can deliver a really cool stimulus is always, I just think it's always a good
100%. Each one costs less than $100. It fits in a little bag, so it's logistically feasible. But also, you are partnered with another individual on your team, so you are affecting their performance. So any team sport athlete where your success relies upon another, that influences it too.
Yeah, it's a very human thing in that, like one of the favorite things that I've been doing this last year with track, and I would warm up even the middle school. A lot of these athletes weren't athletic enough to do it. The high schoolers certainly were, but like I love doing rear foot like squat type applications. Like think a rear foot split squat, but instead of it's a pad, you're holding the other person's foot, so you're partnered. But then we'll do hops forward, and the person behind you is kind of they can manipulate you. They can. Like Frank Fretz just says, they could heckle you if they wanted to, but a lot of times it's just there to have control, and I'll have them do like they might try to lift their knee or on command or stuff like that. But there's just something. I just did a podcast with David Duran just talking about the importance of touch as well, like how many touches you get. And granted, a bullet belt isn't direct physical contact, but you are still connected. I mean, I think everyone who's resisted somebody in sprinting knows that feeling of like, it's like you're pulling back like a horse who's ready to release. And there's just something that's cool about that does go beyond. I mean, technology is awesome, but it's something that it's the thing that technology isn't going to give you. Like you don't have the human direct piece with the machine that's holding you back. And like you said with environment, there's something there.
Totally. And I love the example you gave about those hops moving forward, holding the rear foot. That ensures that no rep is the same, just like sports.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's always, part of it, I always love like having fun in a session too. And it's like, it's a lot of fun. You get like 20 kids lined up and they're doing that, and you're just going to get stuff all across the board. And I don't do just that. That's we usually lead up to that, and then we do a little bit, and you get some athletes who are really getting a lot out of it. And then you get some kids, usually middle school, that they're still learning. But there's usually some smiles along the way, and that's usually a good thing. So,
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's fun with that. Man, I got to go get one of those things now. And so
it was good. Just to tie a bow on that part of it, when Cory and I were thinking about it, this is, I guess, probably summer of 23, going into last year, as far as like what we wanted to do from a training standpoint and bucketing athletes and that sort of thing. Kind of at least 2 questions came up, but the first question was, okay, we sprint profile these athletes, like then what? And I think that's pretty, I think that's actually reasonably common, because everyone's like into force velocity profiling or sprint profiling or whatever. But then it's like, okay, do this profiling and you have useful information that comes out of it. But then what's the training plan from there. Like, and I think that's the piece that is still kind of a work in progress as far as, okay, you have these different profiles, you have the ability to individualize. Well, like what's best practice as far as individualizing, and moreover, how do you do that in a big group setting? So that was kind of like our first question or challenge. And Cory already, described this, but essentially our answer to that, and one that worked out pretty well, both from a logistics standpoint and a result standpoint, was just to essentially allocate the reps differently. That's all it really came down to, as far as which kind of bucket you fell into, i.e., needing more acceleration or needing more top speed or balance. But then the second challenge was just like, okay, we got 40 to 50 guys, every session's in 15 minutes. We're not going to be able to set up like individualized sled loads, which I think is great, but just was not. And I've done it with other teams, Cory and I both have, but it was not realistic for this setting. So in this setting, like, hey, we got these bullet belts, we can get them on in 30 seconds, get in some good quality reps. It's engagement for each guy. That's where these like really fit the bill for this particular application. So I think, again, it's all like what environment you're in, but we found like there is a number of benefits to them and not many negatives for this particular situation. That's for sure. So
yeah, something I've been thinking about a lot is kind of like the mental process of intervention in general. And a lot of this actually started with one of the topics I really like getting into is like human biomechanics based off postural restoration and Bill Hartman's models, and like compression and expansion and layers of compensation and how this shows up in sprinting. And it can be very complex, and you can very, very easily intervene in a way that you don't know if it's doing anything. You might confuse the athlete a little bit, confuse yourself in the process. And so I like the idea. I think Bill had this, has a term like you're hitting a home run. Basically, you're giving a very general prescription and it works. And you didn't need to go through any of the weeds. That doesn't necessarily always work, but that led me to think about, it's like a pyramid where there's the simplest possible interventions on the bottom, and they're the meat and the potatoes, and you're not going to confuse anybody, and you can just maintain a good environment, and you can just do it. And then the next layer up, it's a little bit more complex, but you have a higher risk of maybe doing something you shouldn't, or creating, and so on and so forth. And I feel like maybe the bottom layer in most situations is just do nothing, just time 30s or time some sprints and lift some weights and get strong and do your sport. Then the next layer up is what you could say it's, hey, it's just, do you need acceleration? Do you need top speed? Still very simple, probably not going to confuse anybody. And what I was getting at with this is it was James Wild who has the quadrant. I think he's the original as far as I know, where it's like, okay, are you stride frequency dominant, stride length, air, ground, and I've seen several other organizations and coaches, they're running with that now. I think it's brilliant. But I kind of feel like, the more up you go, there's certainly more nuance. It's like a skilled coach. It becomes more of a skilled practice, but you also have to be really good at that and have to have that eye for it. And so all that just to being said, I think that there's just a very simple elegance, and it probably covers so many bases. It's like, for most athletes, this probably gives you just about everything you would need, so my question though would be like, well, if you did get more complex, what do you guys think of that quadrant? Or if you had more time and space and energy and with any more complexity, any thoughts on further classifications?
Yeah, I think we could individualize those respective drills more, like the 1080, the bull belt type thing. I think with the wickets, we have individual lanes. We probably have 7 or 8 for the team. Maybe we can get a bit more individualized there. Maybe we can examine exactly where touchdown is relative to the hurdles, get into the weeds a little bit there. One thing I was saying, and I'll let Ken answer that too. One thing I'm thinking about it as you're talking about this pyramid concept, and I totally agree with you, is especially with the bullet belts and then the wickets, you're teaching these positions that are all good. Especially with the bullet belts, the deflection, the forward lean, the ability to hold a position, building strength. And then with the wickets, knee drive, touchdown contact relative to the body, those type of things are all effective. And over time, we're going to make a slight change. But I don't, and then you're not over cueing. Yeah. We talk about what words you're using or lack thereof. So I think it's checking a lot of boxes in limited time. But yeah, Ken, if you wanted to address any of that, go ahead.
I mean, agree with all of that both of you guys just said. And, yeah, I think, James's research is really interesting. I'm kind of, aware of that, the quadrants, and then also some of the organizations have kind of taken it and run with it. Like, I think Altus has done that to a certain extent, and others as well, which I think is cool. I think, that'd be one interesting area to like do video analysis on these guys, with James's stuff is specific to acceleration, right? But also to do it conceivably to top speed, and then, kind of see where guys fall. And then if you have the opportunity to, analyze them on several occasions over time, then to see kind of what, where they fall when they're performing best, which I think are kind of the two different layers of James's analyses, essentially, bucketing guys within the quadrants, and then also within those, individual athletes within their quadrants, seeing where they do best. I think all of that is tremendous, certainly from a kind of a biomechanical analysis and a theoretical perspective. I think it really comes down to then, and I know you had a question conceivably, Joel, that we're going to talk about like technology, like where does technology fall into the mix there? It seems to me you just need, probably some pretty good tech to be able to capture that sort of thing, to be able to do that on a, repeated basis. Not like that's a limitation per se, depending on the scenario, but that I think in a theoretical world, that's where tech would have to come into play to be able to accurately capture those whole body kinematic strategies on kind of a day in, day out basis, as James nicely did in his research. As far as what we may do with our groups, I think, Cory already touched upon it conceivably. Just individualizing a little bit more what we're doing in either the acceleration bit or the top speed bit. One thing, and I'll just touch upon this, and just to kind of add a little bit of in-depth context to the wickets as well. So we have specific lanes for athletes based on their height and their top speed, knowing that those things will directly influence kind of what their stride length is at top speed, and then also, kind of what the acceleration pattern is along the way. One interesting thing we found, and Cory and I presented on this at NSCA National Clinic just about a month ago, so none of this is like top secret or anything, but one of the interesting things we found was that actually when we had guys in like their assigned lanes, and then towards the end of the fall semester, and then also in the spring, we would kind of bump them down a lane and then just kind of emphasize higher frequency, turnover, that sort of thing. Because you had mentioned like, what are you doing to influence like stride rate or stride length or whatever. We really see it nicely clean up the mechanics. And perhaps maybe that's not a surprise, but as far as like, really emphasizing being able to exchange the limbs, land closer to the center of mass, like that sort of thing. So I think perhaps just even individualizing whatever feedback we're giving to each athlete, even though with drills like bullet belts or wickets, clearly you're letting the constraint do the talking for you to a large degree. But I think that'd be the probably next steps for us, is just even going a little bit more in the weeds there. So
I think too, we can collaborate, or sync is probably the better word, the work we do in the weight room. We don't necessarily have the buckets in the weight room yet. We do have VBT tech that we use, but it's not quite the same way in terms of the buckets. So that could be a concept we think about too. Ken and I actually just recently talked about adding some sort of change of direction layer into this. Maybe that's a third or fourth bucket that we focus on. And there's a variety of different types of change of direction, and you get into reactive a bit too. So that could be another frontier we explore.
Today's podcast is sponsored by the Just Fly Sports online courses, Elastic Essentials and Sprint Acceleration Essentials. These courses are CEU certified and will expand your viewpoint on explosive athletic performance and skill acquisition. You can head to justflysports.com and click on the courses tab and join the hundreds of other coaches who have already jumped in. Again, you can head to justflysports.com and click on the courses tab to get started. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Yeah. It's almost it's interesting to think of, okay, yeah, let's add this next thing, change of direction, which is huge, obviously, and there's so many ways you can do it too. But it would be interesting to, it's like the people maybe who go quick into a cut, people who can take longer steps. But then again, in the game, there's going to be all sorts of different ways to do that. But yeah, I would be interested in that for sure. I think that would.
And this past year we didn't address it quite as much. There's some change of direction sessions, but they're already getting a lot of that in practice. Just team sport athletes are in general, so we didn't specifically address it as much as the linear speed. But as both you and Cory have mentioned, that'd be there's certainly athletes, some who are quicker than they are fast, and even within that, there's some who are quicker side to side than they are to accelerate, and then there's some who are better to accelerate than they are at top speed. So there's almost like a triangular way you could profile a guy, so to speak. So or at least to evaluate strengths and weaknesses for sure. So
yeah, it makes sense just with like a bucket-based system, especially at first. Like, what are the simplest things? What are the things athletes are not getting as much of in their sport practice specifically, and working with it that way. I wanted to ask you guys, I feel like I had another question, something I just thought of, and it just kind of popped out the window. So hopefully it comes back. I wanted to ask about, I'll go to this one, is thigh angular velocity in the midst of this. I know, Ken, that's something that you've researched and talked about. Is that something that feeds into this, be it anything practical, anything that's measured or understood within the buckets even? I'd like to hear a little bit more about that and as a training
100%.
variable.
So with this most recent, research data collection that Cory and I collaborated on along with a few other people, even though we kind of had these different, you could say archetypes or, composite models or whatever you want to call them for track and field versus team sport, like our fast team sport versus kind of our slower track and field. And even though those archetypes were slightly different, the one thing that consistently trended with top speed, both across the entire population and then within the track and field and within the team sport, was so triangular velocity and triangular acceleration both were significantly correlated with top speed, both across the groups and within the groups as well. And those weren't the only two variables. I mean, you can look at some of the more basic ones like contact time and that sort of thing. Those were related as well. But to your question, Joel, I mean, yeah, it kind of reinforced the thought that, hey, whatever positions you're hitting, and that's kind of a technique or, coordination type of thing, probably just kind of like a technique-based thing for simple terminology, but how fast you're getting there and how fast you're reversing it is maybe more of like a physical capacity, I would almost, define it as. And again, that's just kind of, loose terminology here, but like technique as far as what positions versus how quickly you're getting in and out of those positions. Definitely, like the triangular velocity, triangular acceleration still was, showed up as being important in this most recent data collection. And I think, that's as much kind of the drills you're doing as it is providing just a fast stimulus, on a daily basis, or sorry, on a weekly basis, I should say, a consistent basis for team sport athletes, where maybe they're not always hitting that. And I think, Cory mentioned that moving forward, one area where maybe we would really hope to kind of sync things up perhaps a tiny bit better would be weight room versus track. I always feel like that the thigh angular motion is reflexive for sure. But with that being said, that having a stronger underlying capacity couldn't hurt, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so continuing to maybe develop some things in the weight room that would support that is definitely another avenue to explore. And I know you've had Joe Dulcetti and John Cronin on with the wearable resistance. And so that's not something we specifically discussed maybe for Penn per se, but I know those two guys. And I think that, to me, that makes a lot of sense, at least theoretically, as the wearable resistance and that sort of thing for kind of improving those concepts. That's just kind of my, just going off on a tangent there a little bit. But I think linking things up in the weight room to the kind of triangular velocity, triangular acceleration, and potentially the wearables. Again, I'm not sure if the wearables in like a huge team setting as easy on, easy off as those are. I'm not sure how that would look, but certainly I think there's some promise there. So
yeah, I think it would be.
That's a long-winded answer to a short question.
Yeah,
I'm not. Hopefully that makes sense.
It would be interesting to see. I mean, I in some ways, I think a really fascinating way to train would be your general in the weight room, or with specific nuances here and there based off assessments. But then all your strength comes from wearable and manipulation. However you manipulate those on the field, that's your intervention. And of course, do some sprints and things like that. Of course, hit your top end bucket you're not hitting. But I think it would be. in my mind, what I would almost see as a future would be instead of like over tech, it's almost, yes, use the tech, but it's almost like we're the art because you know exactly where to put all those little, teardrop weights to meet the technical piece the person needs. And then they don't even have to think about it. They just go they do what an athlete should do and just go run and
yeah, it's a really interesting concept for sure. The wearable. I'm kind of excited to see where that goes. I feel like there's a lot of good ideas and still probably, certainly more research to come on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it has a lot of promise for sure. So.
Yeah, for sure. With the thigh angular velocity, something I was thinking of, and I know Chris Korfist has, he's talked about that a lot. He does the leg swings as part of a circuit. And I know a mode of training that Chris likes a lot, I love it a lot, is a flex leg bound. So instead of a straight leg bound, a flex leg bound. I would like to call it a squatty bound. Not really. I mean, it's somewhere in the middle.
Not Joel,
okay?
now you and I are going to have to fight. No,
it's a flex leg bound. But anyways,
now we're all good. No,
yeah. I feel like though that to me, I'd be curious to you guys' opinions on this. To me, that's almost the epitome of a angular velocity in the sense that it kind of it constraints out the swinging action of the shin. Like you can't get fast or be fast by swinging your shin more optimally. It's like you have to switch, or that's where that resonates with a lot of people. Your thighs have to switch very quickly. And then, of course, there's the bounce aspect and the coordination aspect through that. But it seems to me that I guess if you were going to go another layer deeper in, the pyramid and into, hey, if you're, I'm visualizing my pyramid here. But if you are stride length deficient, you're one of those people who's fast and you don't do it through stride length, you're kind of short on your strides, that may be a good, a way to add thigh angular range and velocity for that specific bucket if we decide to go that complex in our pyramid.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'll just comment on that briefly and then turn it over to Cory. But yes, obviously, I know Chris really well. I consider him a good friend, and we've talked about that a lot. I know he does those and swears those. I've never actually done those, but everything you said, I mean, it makes sense. To me, it does make total sense. And Cory and I, actually, just before this podcast, we're just talking about this upcoming year and kind of things we're going to, modify or manipulate or whatever. And so maybe that's one of those things that we, kind of play around with and see how that works. But yeah, it makes sense to me. And I know Chris has had a lot of success with it. So.
Yeah. One of the things that we like to do in our warm-up phase is contrast the lever arm length. So we would do a straight leg variation. Sometimes we would put the arms overhead to emphasize posture. Sometimes we would use the arms naturally, but we would alternate. We would do the straight leg variation, and then we do like just a high knee build up run just to change the lever arm. And then we go back to the straight leg. We would go back to the bent knee just to allow them to feel what we're talking about now with this thigh positioning.
Yeah, Cory, that makes me think about what you just said. Actually, my memory, I said I forgot the thing before. I remembered it. So with 5 minutes to go, I remembered the thing. It was that Ken, and this goes with what you just said, Cory, is Ken, you had talked about like dropping athletes down a lane into higher frequency, I believe. And I just think especially too, it absolves the need and probably being inefficient over cueing an athlete or telling them they should run a certain way just by giving them different experiences at first and allowing them. And I find that the one experience is, like you just said, Cory, it's like you can, the length of the limb shank, a high knee, a short distance away from the body versus a straight leg bound, like a big lever arm, and just how to feel that difference. And then the frequency modulation, like how can you experience different frequencies? Maybe your body just comes up with something. It's like, oh, I just feel better now. I don't know why, but that just felt good. Like I always like those things when those happen, and you don't necessarily have to tell an athlete how to run. You just give them some experiences and you just start seeing things come together. I mean, that's just totally the constraints-based coaching.
We also do, related to that, kind of a dimmer concept. So we want them to experience like all the different positions. So if you're doing a straight leg run, let's start off really low and just think about a dimmer switch, gradually build the height of that. Same thing with the knee bent version of that. We don't say, all right, go to 5 yards, switch the angles. We want them to experience every kind of degree of motion in their thigh.
Yeah, I love that.
100%. And then, just on the wickets piece, Cory and I both like wickets. We know a lot of good coaches who do and a lot who don't. I think the one potential critique of wickets is, hey, you don't want to like just like, make people form fit a certain way of running all the time, and that's all they can do, right? And I think anyone familiar with motor learning, us three included, says, hey, you need some variability, some flexibility with the degrees of freedom of movement and some variability built in there. But I think when we had athletes kick down to a shorter lane, just the next lane down, and emphasize a little bit more turnover, we thought there was a number of benefits to it. Number one, if any of them were struggling at their lane and perhaps were overreaching, which would obviously be an unintended side effect, a negative side effect of WIC, it immediately cured that and made sure that they were really striking correctly relative to their center of mass and cleaned up another basic things mechanically. And then Joel, kind of as you alluded to and as Cory alluded to in the warm-up, now just kind of giving them some more variation as far as what they're doing, even while still being within the wickets. And so we thought it kind of hit both of those aspects from both a kind of a technique, but also like a technique plus a little bit of a variability standpoint. So I thought that was kind of one thing that we did last year that had just qualitatively had pretty good success to it. So
yeah. I love that. I just think it's so easy in life to over-intervene. It's almost like our nature as humans, like every field, every facet, like over-intervene. And I think that's, with wickets, like you said, Ken, some people like it, some people don't. I just think it's a thing that can be good or it can be over-intervened with. To me, the over-intervening is it needs to be this length. They're higher than they probably should be. I just like sticks on the ground. And you need to be in this position too. So it's like, do all these things, the very fixed thing versus think of like a very rich environment where there's all this variability and self-learning happening and different frequencies and positions on their own, and just be an athlete as you're doing this. That's my opinion. So,
no, we've discussed that as well, like tipping the hurdles down and, some of the other things that we know that you've discussed about. And I think there is a lot to be said for some of the variability pieces as well. So
and then from the coach's perspective, you're getting paid more or less to intervene. Like, how do you show value?
Exactly.
Take somebody that's comfortable in what they do with experience to kind of pull back a little bit. Let's let the drill do the work. Let's see some failure over time. Let's let them experience different things. I think it takes a mature coach to be able to do that.
Yeah. Maybe if we were all just living in a tribal village somewhere where there wasn't really money, I don't know. Maybe we'd think about it differently. I don't know. But
sounds amazing.
That's a different podcast topic. Yeah. That'd be great. I love it. All right. Well, hey, if you guys have any closing thoughts, love to hear them. Otherwise we'll wrap things up here for the day.
I'll just, wanted to say thanks again for having us on. Really enjoyed listening to the podcast. Cory and I discuss it frequently. As it relates to kind of, just all of the ideas that are presented, but also kind of what we do with our own training. And so thanks. And we're going to probably tweak a few things for this upcoming year. And so we'll be in touch, with a kind of an update on how things are going for us and anything that we learn over the upcoming year.
Yeah.
We love trying new things. Appreciate you giving us this platform, Joel. Every Thursday, look forward to your podcast coming out. So I don't know if I love hearing myself. I might have to skip this one, but I'm excited to hear the others.
Hey, I totally understand that on my own level as well, Cory. So, hey, well, thank you so much, guys. It was awesome talking to you. I appreciate it.
A lot of fun. Thanks, Joel.
Great. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks again for tuning in to another podcast. I'll see you next week.